one of the obsessions is voice recognition, which he's not going to talk about today. And another obsession that he's got is how you can measure productivity. And he's been involved in a project with OmegaT, and it's also in Trados, where you've been measuring productivity at a very minute level, and that's what you're going to talk about today.
Yes.
Thank you.
Perfect. With one minor correction, and that's that I do plan to speak about speech recognition.
I told you.
Okay, so what I want to talk about is extensive cat tool logging. Okay, so just to make it clear, logging is something, I'm also a programmer, at least I've spent parts of my life programming applications. Programmers generally use logging information to know what's going on in an application. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the work that we did with the research institute that I worked in for a few years in Dublin on measuring translator productivity. What was the motivation for it? What we did, what we're doing now, more commercially, and my experience doing consulting work and work in my own agency, not so much on machine translation, but on translator productivity in general. What's worked, what hasn't. And then I want to finish.
You need to use this microphone.
Oh, okay.
On video.
Oh, of course, of course. Is that better? Or do you want me to get closer to it?
You have to pick it up and move.
Okay. Okay, you got it? I gave a presentation in San Diego. That was also, somebody took a photograph of it, and I held up the transmitter to my voice, to my mouth the entire time. So at least this looks like a microphone. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be talking about, is measuring what's going on in a cat tool. So the genesis of the idea, you see the band Genesis here, Peter Gabriel looking fantastico, happened in about 2009. I had decided to go back to university to do a PhD. I emailed the remaining clients that I had. I was running my translation business part-time at that point because I was working as a programmer for Nokia Siemens mostly. And oh, I can do translations too. Wow. Oh, awesome. I flew to Kuala Lumpur to attend my brother's wedding, and I was in the Trados Inn hotel, which was across the road from this very beautiful building called the World Trade Center in Kuala Lumpur. And I had my laptop with me, but I had forgotten to install Trados, which was at that time Trados Workbench was my default cat tool. Maybe I hadn't forgotten to install it, maybe I'd forgotten to bring my dongle with me. We all remember dongles. In any case, I had to use it. I decided I was going to use OmegaT. Now, I didn't have to use it. It was a 1,000-word marketing document that didn't require a cat tool. I had the terminology in my head because I'd done quite a few translations for that client in the past. But nonetheless, I prefer to work in cat tools. So I downloaded OmegaT. It takes about 5 minutes. And I proceeded to do the translation. Now, at the time, it had a default connection to Google Translate. And I, like most people, had tried out machine translation a few times, and it hadn't really helped me very much in terms of my productivity. I remember trying Sistran back in the 1990s. And I had a sort of a passive interest in it, in the sense that I had studied computational linguistics, so I knew a little bit about how certainly the rule-based systems worked. But I was surprised to see that 2 or 3 of the sentences were really good. They didn't require any post-editing or any corrections. So I proceeded to finish the translation. And at the end, I couldn't tell if I was faster or not, right? I suspected that the 3 sentences that had really helped me, that had been perfect, had lulled me into a false sense of confidence with the machine translation. I had spent too long on other sentences looking for exactly the minimum number of edits, or just being distracted by the machine translation. So I thought to myself, that was at the start of PhD, and I was looking for a topic, and I thought, okay, well maybe that'll be an interesting thing to look at. And it was. So when I came back to Dublin, I sat down at my desk in Trinity, and I looked into what had been done in the area. And I found this application called Translog, which was developed in the Copenhagen Business School by Professor Arndt Jacobsen, who I later on got a chance to spend a week in Copenhagen, and I got to know Arndt. And it's an interesting fact that it was actually programmed by his 16-year-old son, who now works in finance. But Arndt really made his career in an area called translation process research, using data from this application. Now the simplest way to explain what it does is, if you type a sentence, like for example, I saw a canine, and then you delete canine, and then you type dog, it records the whole process, not just the fact that in the end you typed I saw a dog. Is that fairly clear to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. And then there's like a hi-fi system. There's buttons to like fast forward and to pause the replay, so you can see them there. Yeah. But as far as an editor goes, it wasn't particularly great. So think of it like the notepad editor that you find on a PC. Yeah, very, very simple. Not much use to a translator who wants to work with translation memory or a term base, right? They were the, let's say, missing features. So I thought, okay, I'm a Java programmer. OmegaT is an open source cat tool. What's stopping me from reprogramming OmegaT to try to answer the question, am I faster with machine translation? So I programmed a version that also has these Wi-Fi buttons, and it records in XML what happened. So these are keystrokes here. And I actually originally kept the format compatible with Translog, which in retrospect turned out to be a mistake because we ended up breaking that format back compatibility quite quickly, and I still think it really needs to be reworked. But nonetheless, you were able to take these files and put them into Translog, and it would replay, but it also replayed in the Java replayer that I programmed. And then I stopped programming the replayer because we kept on changing the format, and I couldn't be bothered keeping the replayer up to date. But it's good in the sense that it gives you a sense of what the data is. Okay, so this is OmegaT. Even Didier Briel, the project manager for OmegaT, would agree that it's not the most beautiful cat tool in the world, but it is functional. So it gives you your fuzzy matches. This is the editor here, and it had machine translation. And I demoed the application that we had to distinguish from OmegaT, so we called it iOmegaT. At the time, it was around the iPhone, but actually it was supposed to stand for instrumentation. So instrumentation was essentially our fancy word for saying logging. I showed it to a guy called Dave Clark in Welocalize, and he said, yeah, you know what, that actually fills a gap in our thinking, which was, they were nice words to hear. So I spent about a year working in-house with them, implementing iOmegaT to iron out all the issues that would make it possible to put it into production, and they actually went to the effort of integrating OmegaT into GlobalSight, which was their open source translation memory system. And it's still available. Back then, the institute I was working for was called CNGL, Center for Next Generation Localization, but now it's called ADAPT, for anyone who's interested in, I suppose, people who are doing research into technologies that can impact on translators. Okay, so I just want to try and explain what iOmegaT does on the basis of this diagram here, which is obviously an Excel sheet, but pretend that this is the cat tool editor, okay? We've got 20 segments, and randomly some of them have been machine translated, and randomly some have not been machine translated, so the translator is translating from scratch. So far so good? I see everybody nodding their heads, so it must be clear. When you go into the segment, a timer starts. And when you leave the segment, a timer stops. And when you return to the segment, the timer starts again. Okay? We call those segment sessions. So far so clear? Okay. And now you can imagine it's not that difficult to press a button and create a report that tells you how much faster the translator is. Okay? And you don't just do it on one document, you do it on the project. And it doesn't have to be 50% of the segments, it can be 10% of the segments or 20%, just so long as it's enough to get what we call the baseline human translation speed. And typically the amount of data that you want to get is about 1 day of data per category. So if it's HT versus machine translation, you want to get 1 day of human translation and 1 day of machine translation as a very minimum. So I was joking about San Diego. After this, we published a paper on the topic, and that's the title of the paper. It's online, so you can just type it into Google if you're interested. Make yourself a strong cup of coffee. I presented it thinking, oh man, I'm the first person to look at speed data in CAT tools. And a guy from IBM turned up, and it turned out that IBM TM2 had done exactly the same thing, but their algorithm started at the point where the translator typed the first character, which is totally nuts, because as we all know, we open up a segment and spend about a minute thinking what we're going to do to translate, and that's absolutely bad at work. So I think I'm told that they corrected their algorithm to do it our way. So from that, we got a lot of data. So we ended up working on very large projects where machine translation was being used for Autodesk, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, just various large buyers of translation. And we weren't the first people to look at speed data. Mirko Plitt and Francois Masselot had done that. There'll be a reference to that paper on the next slide. They found the same thing that we did, which was a very interesting observation, what I call the Peter and Paul effect. So this is very unusual data. It's very expensive to gather, because we sent the same package, yeah, like an memoQ file, except the OmegaT version, to 2 different translators, yeah? Think of it like we CC'd them, okay? They had exactly the same data, the same MT, the same term base, the same source segments. And they were paired, okay? These were pilot projects. Each one cost about 10,000 euros to pay the translators, so about 100,000 words roughly. I don't know how much it cost, nobody told me, but I'm just giving you a picture, yeah? French-Canadian TR1 and French-Canadian TR2. If you look at the speed gain, French-Canadian TR1 is about 40% faster. His human translation speed is about 700 words per hour. Now I know this seems fast, but these are people who are used to working on Autodesk, okay? And it's all been quality checked. This is all going through the normal quality review cycle. And I looked at the German myself, and I thought it was pretty good. I'm not a native German, but my German is good enough to have some idea. But French-Canadian TR2 was no faster. He was marginally faster, maybe 50 words an hour faster using machine translation, okay? Now what does that do with pricing? What does that tell us about pricing? If I decide that, let's say we have a price of 10 moon cents. This is a fictional currency, right? Okay? Yeah? Because otherwise people start throwing stones. If you've got 10 moon cents for your HT price, and somebody comes along to FRCA-TR1 and says you're 40% faster, will you work for 6 moon cents? FRCA-TR1 is going to say, I've thought about it, I'm going to say no because I'm not going to make any more money. But if you say to him, can you work for 20% less, he'll say yes, because he's still making 20% more than if he wasn't given the machine translation. That make sense so far? Yeah? Now what happens if you do the same thing to Paul? That was Peter, now you're Paul. Paul is only 50 words faster. Yeah? So now you're going to alienate Paul. You're basically saying, work for less, make less money per hour. Right? Yeah? Now, there are lots of points of friction when it comes to machine translation in the industry, in my opinion. This is only one of them, but it's one that I think a lot of people are not aware of, okay? The utility of machine translation is different for different people. And that makes it extremely difficult to manage. So if you have a team of 20 translators, sure, you can come up with some average price. But if you've got 3 translators, that's not enough to build an average. So you're much better off dealing with people on a one-to-one basis, okay? Even if it's just talking to them on the phone and saying, what do you think? Yeah? So, okay, what if you use string distance? Okay, because we can use string distance without capturing any time data. We just look at the XLIF files before the machine translation happened, then we look at the XLIF files after, and we do a log analysis, and that gives us string distance, basically like a log analysis when you're starting a translation. We can do that with existing tools and without asking the translator. The problem is that, imagine if I took away this line, that would look like a fairly random collection of dots, wouldn't it? Yeah? So, the reason I put the graph up there instead of just saying 0.3 on Pearson is that 0.3 on Pearson is quite difficult to intuit if you're not into statistics, okay? If there was a strong correlation, let's say a higher Pearson score, these dots would be all along that line, okay? So what we found is that yes, it's not true to say there's no correlation between edit distance and speed, but it's not a strong correlation, okay? And it's difficult to do important things like pricing based on moderate correlations. And the second thing that we found very interesting was that you would think, intuitively, that French-Canadian TR1 would make the fewest post-edits. He was the fastest, right? Exactly the opposite is the case, okay? In fact, my theory is he just doesn't think too much, he just starts correcting them, okay? He doesn't think, will I correct it? What's the minimum correction I need to make? He just does it really, really fast. So he ends up with a very large edit distance. He corrects the most segments. He makes the most changes in the segments he corrects compared to the other people. And he also got the most gain from the machine translation. Okay? So I guess the takeaway from that is, if you own an agency and you're using edit distance for things like pricing, and in particular for things like machine translation quality, okay? What is quality of machine translation if it isn't utility for the translator, right? So if you looked at edit distance as a measure of quality of machine translation, you would get the opposite of the true value here. You see the point? Now, it's not true for every translator, because some people do correlate, but it's true for the rockstar post editor, okay? For FRCA TR1, okay? So just be careful. Luckily, memoQ solves that problem. Okay, so this is just a list of things that I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and I just thought, actually, I might just put this together as a summary of my recommendations for machine translation pricing, because speaking to Kurti Bashi a while ago, he told me that was the most clicked blog on his blog entry on his blog. So it is something that I think interests some people. How many people in the room here are translators? And how many people work for agencies? Okay, perfect. So we have about a 50-50. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so the first thing is, it depends what kind of agency you run, right? If you're on the kind of low end of the price scale, forget these, right? But if you're concerned with quality, I think these are good. Certainly, these are tips that I would implement in my own agency, which I must stress doesn't actually use machine translation very much, okay? I would say less than 5% of what we do involves machine translation. So the first thing is, do not ask for word price discounts on full quality translation for publicly available machine translation systems like Google Translate. The reason is obvious. The translator can access that themselves, okay? And they're being asked to produce full quality translation. For customized machine translation, where the translator doesn't have access to the machine translation, or where you've agreed with the customer that there's a compromise in, let's say, style, what we call light post-editing, I would recommend that you pay the translator the full price for 2 days if you're working with a freelancer, okay? If you're working with in-house translators, it's a different story, okay? After that period,
yeah.
Of course.
What do you mean by 2 days?
2 days of, so if it's a 300-word job, then it doesn't apply. But let's say you've got a 10,000-word document,
okay,
right? And that's going to take you a month to translate. I'm saying when you send out the first part of that document, send out 5,000 words or whatever 2 days worth of work is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure.
Oh, by the way, just for information, I'm an interpreter. I'm butchering your language. Some of the people are like, learn English. If you could speed them just a notch.
Slow down.
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Of course. Of course. Yeah, negotiate a discount. So try and get the speed difference between the machine translation and not having the machine translation. The way we did it was at the segment level, which has advantages because then you don't need to worry about which job is good for MT and which job is not. But you can also do it using memoQ, using the, we'll come to that in a second, I'll pull that up on the screen. But don't start to negotiate on price until both of you have numbers that you both believe that are objective in terms of your productivity. Okay? Be aware also that the MT quality or the utility for that particular text can drop at any time. Okay? You might be translating IT documents and then along comes a EULA, which is like a legal document, and the machine translation is not useful. And if you've got 20% discount on your full word price, it's not fair on the translator. They're not making what they normally make, and it should be okay for them to email the project manager and say, listen, I'm losing money here. Can you issue the purchase order for the full price? Okay, and it is shock. I mean, I could tell you some horror stories about the way agencies are going out with machine translation at the moment, because we work with a lot of agencies and they do not understand this. Another thing that we've been doing for the very small volume of work that we did with machine translation was we did blind provenance tests. So the reviewer had to try to guess if it was a HT or an MT segment. Does that make sense? Going back to that? Yeah? So you had to guess if it was green or blue, yeah, without being told. Okay, and if you can't guess, then the assumption is it's fine. Okay? Or if you can guess, but you can only guess 20% of the time, and you've agreed it's like post-editing, again, it's fine. Okay? It just gives you an objective number. The mistake that a lot of companies are making is they're using things like Lisa QA or DQF or whatever to annotate the mistakes that the translators make and categorize them. And first of all, that's backbreaking work. Translators hate doing it in my experience. And it doesn't actually give you an objective score, it just gives you the score that the reviewer wanted to give the text. In my experience, as the person filling out that form very often. Okay. Okay, so moving on to memoQ, because this is memoQ Fest. This is from the most recent version of memoQ. It's a program that Kilgrave have implemented recently. Is that right, Peter? Yeah. So it's essentially what I was talking about earlier with application programming. So the problem with a desktop-based application like memoQ is, in a lot of cases, you don't know what's going on. It's not as big a problem with a web-based application because you can look in the log files on the server and you can see what's happening. But when somebody installs it, and works at the bottom of a mine, yeah, where there's no internet and no connection, you just don't know what they're doing within the application, which is what they like about it. But it helps publishers of software to get a picture of which features are being used, and also it can be helpful if a bug occurs. It can help you to reproduce the bug. So it's a really useful thing to do. In this case, it's anonymous, but when I worked for Siemens, we didn't have to worry about that because the customers were internal. But so you get the log file and then you ring up the guy who sent it to you, and the two of you would work through it until you were able to reproduce the error in the application. Yeah, so that's what that logging data is used for. But that's not quite the use case that I'm discussing here. What I'm more concerned with is translator productivity. Okay, so if you want to know what your words per hour are, one way of doing it would be to look at your log file. Let's say you're translating a science fiction novel, which Marek and I were discussing. America's next door. You're just going to have new word segments, right? Make sense? Yeah. So you look at what time you start at, write it down on a napkin. You look at what time you finish at, let's say 6 p.m., just before dinner. You took an hour for lunch. You maybe took a couple of breaks for 15 minutes. But it requires quite a lot of discipline, okay? It's not ideal. And then the second thing is that it's a bit complicated if you're not translating a novel. If you're translating something technical with weighted word counts, with discounts applied to that by an agency or by a translation department or whatever, you know, you're going to be calculating based on the weighted word count, okay? So it's not ideal. And if you want to try to see if some change you're making in your process that only makes a small change, let's say a 10% change to your productivity, something this inaccurate is unlikely to show it to you. Does that make sense? But luckily, Kilbray to the rescue, there is an editing time report. Now, I've trained a good few translators that work for Transpiral into using, not into using memoQ, but I've shown them how to do things in it that they didn't know how to do. Every time I get somebody on Skype, I always ask them, do you know about the editing time report? And they always say no. So I have to ask people here, if before I talked about it, had anybody used it? Okay, okay. So we have 4 hands. Where's the camera? Oh yeah, there it is. 4 hands. Yeah, so not many people are using this feature, I suspect. Very hard to know. The difference between OmegaT and this feature is that it doesn't have segment level A/B testing. So you have to send a project that's been machine translated to somebody, and then you have to send them a similar project that hasn't been machine translated. And ideally you need to keep doing that at least 40 times, because statistics only start to make sense when you have 20 samples. Okay? Right? So that's a lot of project management effort. Alright. The second thing, and this is actually a mistake that we made as well, having a cutoff that's user definable isn't a great idea. We were originally using cutoffs of 5 minutes for technical documentation with 20 words or so, you know, average 25 word segments. And then for patents, we had a cutoff of 15 minutes, okay? So the cutoff is essentially when you don't take that segment into consideration because the translator went for lunch during that segment. Does that make sense? Yeah? And I was talking to Marek, and he was experimenting with it as well. You can end up with different words per hour depending on how you set that. It's this setting here. Sorry, it's a bit blurry. This one here.
Can you make it not so blurry?
I can't really. No. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So this is the reason I put these 2 screens up here is because this is actually how you have to turn it on first, which is good. It's opt-in, and come back to that. Okay. So you turn it on first in memoQ through options. It's on the very right on the options panel, and then afterwards you have to run the editing time report. That's easy to find because it's near the log analysis. It's just below I think the post editing, the post translation report. Okay. And it breaks down the different speeds into the different categories.
Excuse me, do you use a tracking tool?
Yeah, like rescue time or something?
Well, Toggle, but anyway.
Toggle, yeah.
And then basically, how do you know that I did not go for coffee, pee, on the phone kind of thing with this one?
Because if you stop doing anything for 15 minutes, it doesn't take into account.
But that's still not precise enough. Like, this is not precise enough.
But the toggle does exactly the same thing. It's looking at.
I do that.
Oh, you turn it on and off.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, yeah. So if you're disciplined enough to turn on, on and off a button for when you're working, that's fine. Yeah. But this software was written for people who weren't.
Not the software.
We had a discussion about that. Should we have a button that people turn on and off? And we decided that not many people would be yes.
Very much not correct.
You think that's not correct?
Very much not correct.
Well, we do video, we have a thing called a video test protocol, so we test it to make sure it is correct. That's what most of our time is spent doing.
Can I translate?
Our recommendation is that we set the threshold. We mainly do IT kind of translation, so we ask the translator to set the timeout threshold for about 2 to 3 minutes, depending on it, because that's pretty realistic. If you are not doing something for 2 or 3 minutes, you probably come for a coffee break or something like that.
Yeah. So if it's material they're very familiar with and the sentences are short, you might get away with 3 minutes. I think 5 minutes is the reason we set 5 minutes actually was because, and we kept it that way, was because we wanted to make sure that the data was comparable across different projects. Yeah, even if it was not perfect. And actually, your point is good, and it turns out I'm prepared for it, because we did find that by setting different thresholds, you ended up with different word counts, words per hour, okay? And there are algorithms, for example, an algorithm called Cook's distance, which will find outliers, okay? So that's actually, I think that's a better approach. So this is not actually data from a CAT tool. I just grabbed this off the internet the other day from just a random statistical report. But the point is that you can see these outliers here and pretend that these are words per hour inversely. So this is a very slow segment, and these are sort of normal speed segments. And then this segment is, this segment was somebody took a coffee break, and this segment is somebody went for lunch, okay? This segment is, it just took longer to translate, okay? But also maybe this segment just took longer to translate. It's not a coffee break, okay? So you're not, it goes back to what you're saying. You can't be perfect, okay? You can only do your best to get the closest approximation. But we did do a lot of testing with, we would do a small translation, and we did video testing protocol where we annotated the video of the person working with the CAT tool and then put that into an Excel sheet to calculate all the numbers. We also did something similar to what we call back of napkin calculations, where we would record the breaks just like you were doing. We used rescue time instead of toggle, and looked at the log files, and we came up with more or less the same numbers that we were coming up with. So we spent, like, I've been working on this for about 5 years.
I trust you.
Yeah. But it is, the thing is, I mean, the whole general point is it is actually hard to get a handle on what your words per hour are. Yeah? I mean, okay, we all know that if a text comes in at 9 o'clock in the morning and you look at the log file and you've translated for that project before and you know what kind of document it is, you have a fairly good idea what time you're going to finish at. Yeah? But overall, it's difficult to know what your productivity is because you're so focused on the actual translation itself. So it's much better to let the CAT tool do that work for you, in my opinion. Okay, so let's do a hands up. Does this kind of stuff make anybody feel nervous? Yeah.
The GDPR or which one?
Yeah, this is why I had to do the slide. I haven't seen any of the presentations because I spent the last 2 days doing the slides. Because I spent the whole last week doing review of GDPR documentation. So yes, GDPR makes me nervous. So this makes a lot of people nervous because who wants their work to be monitored, right? Yeah? How would you feel about having a camera behind you, or, you know, it's just, you know, that's the reason behind the title, yeah? This is useful data, but we have to be careful that it doesn't become Big Brother, right? Okay? There is absolutely a danger that if words per hour data becomes ubiquitously and always available to translation agencies of a certain type, not every agency, they will start to use that data to try to negotiate lower word prices on material where the machine translation doesn't help. It's just easy it's easy material. Now they already do that because a project manager looks at it and goes, that's an easy document, we're not going to send that out at our high word price. But nonetheless, we do have to be careful about how the data is shared. And I'll be coming back to that in a bit, okay? So this is MakeCat. This is a web-based CAT tool that was developed mainly by a company in Rome called Translated. It was an FP7 project, had about 3.3 million or so euros of funding. It's been in production for a few years now, and it has a words per hour report, and you cannot turn it off. There is no opt-out. Okay? So if I send you a job in OmegaT, and we have used it in, you know, a couple of times to get us out of difficult situations with cat tools in Transpiral. If I send you a document in OmegaT for translation and a purchase order, your only choice is to turn it down. That's the only way that you can prevent me from seeing your words per hour on that particular document. Okay? And I did say it to the owners that they probably should make that an opt-in feature, because it's illegal to capture words per hour in certain conditions. Now, there's a lot of, I would say, misinformation around this. I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal training whatsoever, okay? But I have spoken to people who know more about this than I do. And I'm told that if you work for the government or you work for SAP, for example, if you work for a large private sector company or a government organization that has a works council, these are typically the kind of companies that have works councils, in order to measure any unit working speed, that has to be passed through the works council first for permission, and typically they'll say no to that request. They can say yes if they want to, but typically they'll say no. So, so for that reason, you know, if OmegaT were implemented in, I don't know, the EPO or something like that, the European Patent Act, which I know they don't, but if they did, they'd have to implement a feature that has at least an opt-out for the speed data. And I think it's interesting just from an economics perspective. So translators do not pay for OmegaT. This is a free cat tool for them, right? Yes. Here.
It's a signal that you've got 5 minutes.
Sorry?
It's a signal that you've got 5 minutes or less.
Oh, do I? I thought you started with 15 minutes and gave me 15 minutes more time.
No, you would.
Oh, right.
Your time.
Oh, I did it. Why is this happening here? Well, that's good because there's no electricity coming out of this. Anyway, hopefully this won't, my laptop won't die.
4 minutes.
No, that's okay. Look, this is all the slides we have, so. All right, I'll go through them quite quickly. So, as Peter said, I'm very interested in speech recognition. I think machine translation is useful for certain types of texts, but translators use speech recognition software. It's useful for many translators translate almost all their texts using speech recognition software. Gains from speech recognition, so only 10%, I don't know, 6 years ago reported using speech recognition, automatic speech recognition, and two years ago it was 15%. So about 1% per year of translators are starting to use speech recognition, according to an ITI survey, which is in the UK. That's relevant because the ITI has more into English translators. And this was a survey that was done in the University of Leeds, so we can see that a lot of translators are using Dragon into English, which is how I get to see it, because we work with a lot of into English translators. And a lot of them are using memoQ, and it turns out that memoQ is one of the best, if not the best, cat tools for working with Dragon, which is really cool. Okay, so really the whole point of this is to try to convince Kilgrave to implement a feature or features in memoQ which would support getting logging data, but doing it with respect for the translators who are paying for memoQ Pro. Okay? The data should be optionally anonymous, optionally no linguistic data, especially at super project level. And my particular interest in this, but there are many others, like just yesterday we were talking about cat tool freezing because of various things happening. That would be shown up in this kind of log data as well. The main reason I would like to see it is because I want to be able to show, using objective data, what the benefits are from speech recognition. I have a friend in Munich that I go for beers with once a month. He works for us as a translator, and he's doubled his income just by using speech recognition. And that's a fun thing to do, when you can double someone's income just by giving them an hour tutorial on how to use something. Okay, so I think that the segment level time should be recorded in a machine readable format that can also be opened up in an editor, so not binary. I don't think it should be via an API. I think it should be stored locally on the disk. The data shouldn't go past something like 2 gigabytes. And after 2 gigabytes, I'm directing this at Peter now, after 2 gigabytes, it should be uploadable to a server. And it doesn't have to be a special server, just an FTP server is fine, okay? And then deleted from the local hard drive. And the reason you want to do that is that you don't use up all the space on the translator's hard drive. And then, particularly at a super project level, so at an actual project level, there are reasons why a translator might want to share the data with an agency, so you don't have to be concerned about non-disclosure agreements. But to measure the productivity of translators working for, let's say, 2 months on lots of different customers, you want to make sure that any third party that has access to that data cannot see anything that's customer specific. So for example, project titles shouldn't be in there. That's customer specific. It often has product names in them. Linguistic data, anything that's in the exit file that's linguistic, any term-based entries, stuff like that. So just be sensitive to the NDA is all I'm really saying. Okay. There are risks which I've discussed. Let's just make it as hard as possible for agencies to renegotiate word prices based on speed. Okay. But bearing in mind that all they have to do is put it into MakeCat, so let's not get too excited. I think that if we do that, what you'll find is you've got people like Janae Spry or Kevin Losner and people who coach translators and show them how to use features of CAT tools. And I think this will make their job easier to get objective data. I can tell you from having talked to hundreds of translators, it's very difficult to get a handle on productivity just by talking to somebody. Right? Also from my own research background, I can tell you that being able to get data from people who are actually working with prototype systems would be really useful, especially for getting more funding from the useful stuff. Helping agencies and buyers identify bottlenecks is what we were talking about yesterday, where the memoQ server gets slow because of performance issues, and if that slows down the translator, it'd be nice to be able to see that on a graph. Okay. And also to encourage translators to try out MT for themselves and see what the results are. And what you can do is you can mix the machine translation in the same document. Machine translation is inherently imperfect. There's no reason why you can't put Google Translate and Microsoft Translator Hub into the same document randomly and then produce the same kind of report that I showed you earlier to say how much faster you were with Google Translate. Yeah? Fairly clear?
Yeah, we were discussing that in the workshop yesterday, and I said that whenever I use machine translation, I would do pre-translate or X-translate first, then do machine translation.
Yeah.
Then I would have my use switched on. But then what helps is, like, let's say, vocabulary or terminology with the moving the letters left and right, or like the I don't know, sections selected. I really hate typing.
Yeah.
Sad to say that.
What's your target language?
Both Hungarian and English.
Yeah.
And I pretend to be translating from Italian, and sometimes into Italian, but that's just depending. So the thing is, like, I really like the feature of moving, like, sections and collocations, and that makes it fast. But then I don't know, like, how many people would be, just into, like, kind of like speed up versions or solutions or.
You mean like a feature that you might add to memoQ to?
No, it's already there.
Yeah. Yeah. So the whole point of this is that there are translators, which I find fascinating, that have come up with really smart ways of increasing their productivity. But because 75% of translators, according to the EU, are freelance translators, they're sitting at home in a sort of an island where this island of innovation no one really knows until you actually talk to them. And because I do this and I publish on thing and I talk at conferences, a lot of people do tell me what they're doing to improve their productivity, and it's fascinating. But what I would really like to do is take what I'm learning from them, anonymize it by all means. Some people don't care if it's anonymized, right? Yeah. But most people will, and show it as tips and tricks to other people. Because I know from working with translators in Transpiral that most people are not using the features of their CAT tool. Most people are doing 2,500 words a day, especially into Irish Gaelic, which is the other language that we do. Yeah? Because there's no good machine translation for that language. There's no speech recognition at all. There never will be in my lifetime, I suspect, at least not from Dragon. So, yeah.
Can I suggest that we move the conversation out to the coffee?
Yeah.
It started with the bookkeeper. Apologies for this, but
sure.
I'd just like to finally end up by thanking John for a very interesting presentation. From the perspective of Kilgrave, we do have an issue that the features that we already have, like distance reporting, time reporting, are not the ones that people are screaming to us to fix at the moment. And most people that are screaming to us or fix have another 600 issues that they're screaming about beforehand. but you're very welcome to campaign.
Yeah.
And you know, I'd just like to also thank everybody for the questions were asked during this. And thanks again, John. Let's talk in the coffee if you want to talk more. Thank you.